I can't put into words how much I love what Age of Sigmar does with its armies. Everyone gets a chance to shine and do their own thing, and almost all of them are treated with some measure of respect. Beasts of Chaos notwithstanding, speaking of which, I am so sorry to all of you who collect that army. But that follows an even older tradition of GW hating the Beastmen, so I can only summon up so much shock and outrage for it. For real though, even less prominent armies like the Ogres and Sons of Behemoth are treated as proper factions. They get less lore, but what they get treats them as worthy additions to the setting. And the Hedonites of Slaanesh are in my mind the ultimate example of this. If what happened to Slaanesh in AOS happened in 40k, the entire faction would be getting Yanari'd, which is ironic given how Slaanesh is the one screwing over the Yanari. But at least by this point, the Hedonites of Slaanesh are something masterfully done. Because sure, those of you who look at your army suffering any sort of loss would think I'm insane. Slaanesh is in jail, how dare they? Yet in spite of that, the Hedonites of Slaanesh are still given some narrative credit. Things are still happening with them, they haven't completely gone down the black hole into the narrative junk drawer. And their models, oh my lord, in spite of being pretty far from the spotlight, they're eating. But let's save any more talk like that for the pros and cons sections, yeah? Do you love the color purple? Do you think the phrase too much of a good thing is the dumbest thing you've ever heard? Do you never delete your search history not because you have nothing to hide, but because you just don't care if someone sees it? Then come one, come all, because the Hedonites of Slaanesh are here for you. But before we talk about Slaanesh, a word if you will. A lot of people think Slaanesh is just non-stop horny. This is not true, Slaanesh does other things. But horny is certainly a part of it, and as such I have for you today the sponsor of this video, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve is the finest purveyor of adult toys to ever grace this planet. To showcase this to the best I can on YouTube, allow me to read for you just a few of the many categories of items they have in store for you. Rabbits, wands, realistic, huge. Keep in mind, that's categories of items. Whatever bits you might have, Adam and Eve have got something for them. But all that you can go see for yourself, which you might not know is some of the other reasons to make this your dealer of choice for pleasure. There's a 90-day return policy and 24/7 customer service. Unsatisfied? One way or another, you won't be for long. Discreet shipping as well, so there's no need to worry about anyone knowing what makes you go bump in the night. They've been doing this for over 50 years, so you know they're legit with it. And if you're feeling a bit guilty, just know that 20% of their profit goes to fighting the spread of HIV worldwide. That's a good cause if I've ever heard one. And just to blow your mind once more, some special savings for you. Go to adamandeve.com and use code Pancreas to get not only 50% off one item, not only free rush processing, but free shipping in the US and Canada. Some exclusions apply. I understand the pancreas isn't a terribly sexy organ, but with that code it sure can be. Get yourself some Adam and Eve products today, so tonight can be that much better. Now then, sex joke. Just kidding, there'll be more than that here. The Hedonites of Slaanesh are of course the Slaaneshi faction in Age of Sigmar, in spite of the fact that Slaanesh is gone. In fact, how about we talk about that? Because I still get kinda confused on the mechanics of some of that, so I'm hoping someone else can clear it up a bit. During the end times, Slaanesh's stomach was a bit too full from voring all of the elves of fantasy. So she had to go hide in a cave for a bit while she was digesting all those delicious elf souls, which incidentally, yes, apparently chaos gods can get indigestion. Except Nurgle probably, although in his case I assume he always has the indigestion and just stoically accepts it. Unfortunately for she who thirsts, some of the elves of fantasy not only weren't eaten, but had gained godhood in the meantime. So while Slaanesh was presumably taking one of those dumps where you gotta take your shirt off because it's so intense, Tyrion, Teclis, and Malekith rolled up and started literally beating the elf out of Slaanesh. No holds barred, steel chair over the head, probably giving her swirlies too. After this, they locked her up in the subrealm between the realms of Shadow, Ulgu, and Light, Hysh, imprisoning her with all sorts of magical defenses, illusions, and chains that can only be broken under either incredibly specific circumstances or with extreme magical force and events. She was essentially removed from the great game of the Chaos Gods. The thing I'm confused on is that Chaos was supposedly destroying other realities between fantasy and AOS, so I always wondered how Slaanesh was still glutted from the end times for this. I could just be missing something, but there are still some explanations I can see. Maybe it was because she ate specifically so many elf souls at once, it just took it out of her, or maybe the gods and heroes she ate were giving her trouble digesting. Kinda confusing, but I'm sure you can find an explanation if you look hard enough. My biggest source of confusion on it is mostly how Slaanesh helped destroy those realms while she was still suffering from this, but maybe she just didn't participate. These chains weren't perfect though, or rather they might have been as close as you can get, but Morathi did a little bit of a funny. Aside from just being a power-hungry monster, she was a little bit bitter that her son, Tyrion, and Teclis got to become gods in this new reality, and she she didn't. So as a way to help her attain true godhood, as well as just getting more souls for herself, she altered things to make it so she got just a little bit more of a share of elf souls than was originally allocated to her. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that it threw things ever so slightly out of whack and caused Slaanesh's chains to weaken over time. She then went on to get the mother of all backhands from Nagash, which was well deserved. Of course, in spite of this, Slaanesh was still firmly locked away at this time. Not a single one of her followers knew where she was, and in turn, she couldn't reach out to them. This is a slight issue for followers of a chaos god, and it caused them much physical and spiritual pain, and her worshippers split into 3 major camps over how to handle the issue. Very conveniently, these 3 camps are also the 3 major ways you can run a Hedonites army with the subfactions. They are the Invaders, the Pretenders, and the Godseekers. For the Invaders, they just don't give a shit that Slaanesh is gone. They're gonna keep on invading, pillaging, and assaulting in every sense of the word. Who cares that the sugar mama is gone when there's still so much fun to be had? The other 2 groups are pretty obvious in what they are. The Pretenders tend to be led by one particularly powerful Slaaneshi champion, or quite frequently a keeper of secrets. Their leader thinks they can claim the throne Slaanesh left behind, and attempt to fill her spot and achieve full-blown godhood. Almost certainly well beyond the pay grade of anyone trying, but ego and vanity of that size are quite fitting for a Slaaneshi champion. The Godseekers, meanwhile, are actively looking for Slaanesh, hoping to restore her to her place amongst the Chaos Gods. This group seems to be the one GW is most focusing on for the Hedonites of Slaanesh narrative. Some of the other invaders also went a bit nuttier than they already were as Slaanesh worshippers and started worshipping Archaon as the new Slaanesh, which is very funny. When Chaos came to the Age of Sigmar, Slaanesh and her followers were for the most part a bit more subtle than the other Chaos Gods, as is often the case. Aside from Olgu with the Shadow War and Hysh, where Slaanesh demons were recreating the fall of the Eldar, it was a lot more spread out across the realms. Tzeentch, for instance, had a hard-on for Shaman, where Slaanesh's servants put a small cult here, a small cult there, waiting for the perfect time to strike. Or never strike at all, because a never-ending party away from the eyes of the rest of society is perfectly good enough for Slaanesh. Perhaps something bigger was coming, but then the elf gods put her in prison, so it mostly remained at that level. In spite of the physical and emotional trauma they suffered because of this, like I mentioned earlier, the groundwork for a whole load of Slaanesh cults was already laid in the foundations of the mortal realms going forward. Throughout the Age of Sigmar storyline, Slaanesh has still in many ways been in the background. Slowly but surely though, she's getting ever closer to breaking out. One chain imprisoning her had to be broken by the one who hated her most, which turns out to be Khorne, who would never willingly do that. So she sent someone to steal an axe from Big K, which naturally pissed him off, and when said someone killed Karanak the Khorne dog, who was sent to retrieve it, Khorne's rage was so great it shattered the chain. Slaanesh then immediately put in place an illusion of the chain with the newfound power she gained from the slight leeway. Another chain had to be broken by a great betrayal, which was fulfilled when some Stormcast pulled a 40k and slaughtered a whole load of cities of Sigmar citizens. When Nagash tried to become omnipotent again and was thwarted by the Skaven again, the shockwaves of the Necroquake shattered another chain because it sort of rewrote how reality worked. She had a bit of a panic attack when it looked like Nagash was going to win, but that was averted and she calmed down. And when Morathi got all up in her guts and ascended to godhood, yet another chain was broken, which Morathi oddly didn't seem terribly interested in at the time. She surely would have noticed she was right there, but she doesn't seem to care. Post-godhood refractory period maybe, she's still riding the high I guess. All throughout this, Slaanesh was able to creep ever closer to Olgu. Her followers had slightly more sway there than anywhere else, and with her gaining some limited ability to guide them and them some limited ability to sense her, they began attacking in greater earnest than before. Whatever mystery dark elf equivalent there is hard at work fighting them back, but between Morathi's initial shenanigans and the constant shattering of the chains binding her, Slaanesh's freedom is closer than ever before. She was even able to create 2 new beings of excess, Dexessa and Sinessa. She made them by spitting, by the way. Spat up a glob of what was hopefully saliva but was probably something else and turned it into something called the Newborn, which then quickly turned into the twins. They had a pretty mediocre first performance, and that isn't just me saying that, Be'lakor made fun of them too, but their very existence shows Slaanesh's ability to influence the mortal realms is growing greater and greater. Time will only tell if the other gods will be able to keep her in chains, or if one day she'll break free and demand her spot back from the Great Horned Rat. So, why play as her followers? Well, if you like actually moving narratives, then you're in for a treat. Their whole thing is moving towards freeing or replacing Slaanesh. It's a narrative that's been built upon the foundations of AOS to some extent, and while it's a slower one, it does make an appearance every now and then. And it's an actually moving narrative. Sure, she still isn't free, but there's been tangible things done that point to her imprisonment not being forever. The twins being born is the chief proof of this, but she was also able to promote Sigvald to not quite demon princehood once he was freed. That wouldn't have happened as she was when she was initially in prison. She didn't have the ability. Stuff is actually happening, and if you like being part of that, this is a great army. This extends to some extent to characters as well, since Sigvald is back. Funnily enough, he doesn't seem to be too mad about Throg pissing on him anymore and is focusing his attention on Nagash for imprisoning him in a magical mirror. Here's hoping someone resurrects Throg so we can get round 2 on that fight. Speaking of narrative though, they're also proof you can have an army go through some pretty extreme downturns that actually mean something without it destroying the faction. Slaanesh, for all the progress being made to find her, is still gone. The throne lies empty, no one stepped up to take her place. The Great Horned Rat doesn't count, he has his own throne made out of dead Skaven. And yet, this army is still doing stuff. The army is still present, causing all sorts of havoc and alive in both narrative and tabletop. This is admittedly more of a meta thing, but by God am I gonna champion it here. Look, you can hurt your army's narrative and things can still be okay. For something a bit more specific to them though, this does make them chaos underdogs. Out of all the chaos armies, they're easily the one the farthest behind, and it's nice to root for the little guys every now and again. For more general stuff, Slaanesh stuff. As you probably know, Slaanesh is the god of hedonism, excess, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Especially in AOS, they're moving away from those last things, but the vibe of going overboard is still very much intact. Some of the models like that Glutos fella, who I keep calling glucose by mistake because diabetes and fat, are great examples of this. It isn't just horny here, although horny is certainly there. It's pure obsession and excess, the inability to stop what you're doing because by God it just speaks to you even if it ain't good for you. It's killing 1,000 people because you need inspiration for the ultimate song or poem. If you're absolutely obsessed with something or just want to have the best possible time, the Hedonites are the place to be. Hedonism isn't their name after all, what did you expect? They're also for those of you who are rather vain about their appearance. I'm gonna be real with you, that's like half the reason I'd go with Slaanesh. Nurgle is disgusting, Tzeentch aside from almost certainly dicking me over for giggles would turn me into a tentacle monster, and while he wouldn't necessarily make me gross, I'm just straight up not built for corn. Slaanesh meanwhile wants you to look beautiful. Will you maybe grow crab claws and extra tits? Sure, maybe, but by that point you'll probably consider that beautiful, so who cares? And if you're the kind of person who's all about being the best you can be, the Hedonites are for you. Think about it. Nurgle's the opposite. He wants you to wallow in what you are and never change. Tzeentch might be about that in some ways, but then he also thinks that you should be allowed to stab each other in the back at the slightest possible reason. Khorne too, although it's more stab in the face. Slaanesh though, she wants what's best for you. Her and her followers would be great workout buddies, I bet. Not like Khorne, who throws you into shark-infested waters to teach you how to swim. Slaanesh is all about taking it at your pace. And hey, maybe these supplements would help you get some more muscle on you. While you're at it, why not try some steroids? That's still not enough? No worries, friends. Slaanesh is here for you. Try some steroids mixed with the blood of at least 50 different people and crack. And sure, the gym equipment might moan when you re-rack the weights, but you'll be the best you possible, and damn what anyone else thinks about it. Slaanesh can also easily be the most horrifying of the Chaos Gods if you're into that kind of stuff, albeit not jump scare horror. More the horror of what some people are willing to do. It's chasing after the ultimate high taken to the extremes. The Hedonites will do whatever they take to get what they want, damn the body count. Some body horror too, because good god, looking at some Slaanesh art is like looking at H.R. Geiger artwork if he had a bad trip the day before. For tabletop, the first positive that comes to my mind is that this is a fast army. Chariots going 10 inches might not blow your mind, but then you keep looking. Demonettes can run and charge in the same turn, Blissbarb archers can run and shoot, and Seekers not only roll 2d6 when they run, but can also run and charge. Seems like half the roster has that ability. Did your opponent really cock up their placement and leave something nice and squishy out in the open? Turn 1 charge from your Seekers. It's now dead. They're only 140 points for 5 models, that could be a decent trade, although more on that later for why I say trade and not snipe. Positioning yourself where you need to be is rarely going to be a challenge, to the point that the biggest issue you might have is overextending and getting unit wiped out. For God's sake, even Glutos can run and charge in the same turn. This rather conveniently extends into a Hedonites army having the potential to be absolutely brutal on the charge. They can hit reasonably hard in general, but charging is of course the best way to do that. Sigvald can have up to 12 attacks because he either has 5 or whatever your charge roll was, whichever is higher. Chariots cause D3 mortal wounds on a 2-up when they charge, and the Exalted Chariot can cause a whole ton of wounds depending on the save of the unit it charges. There's other shenanigans too, but for the sake of brevity, just know that if you like charging, there's a lot here to make you happy. Causing wounds likely won't be too much of an issue either, depending on who you're facing. Almost everything in the roster has rend -1, with -2 being by no means uncommon. A lot of characters hit and wound on 3s, and if they can't, they usually have some sort of utility to make use out of. Aside from that, I'm willing to say the rest of the army falls in one of 2 categories. Option 1 is that they hit and wound on 3s again, which is nice, or they hit on 3s and wound on 4s, and and also have a shitload of attacks across the unit. Let me show you some demonettes to show what I mean. 110 points for 10 of them, and they're 2 attacks a pop, hitting on 3s, wounding on 4s with rend -1 and damage 1. That's 20 potential attacks that'll cut through some chaff quite nicely, and even moderately armored units should be wary with the rend in play. The Blissbarb archers have the same thing except for their ranged attacks. Keepers of Secrets, meanwhile, hit and wound on 3s for just about all their attacks, and their claws can cause 5 damage a pop as long as they haven't taken too many wounds. 380 points for that, so it's a bit pricey, but if you can throw it at something important quick enough, it won't be too hard to make those points back. In fact, Slaanesh heroes seem to be phenomenal at taking on enemy heroes. The Keeper of Secrets Ritual Knife as a weapon is pretty mid, but its ability lets you cause up to 6 free mortal wounds to something that's wounded nearby. The other option lets you heal for free, up to 6 wounds if you killed a hero that turn with it. Sigvald can rip apart most other heroes he gets close to, and overall, given the amount of attacks they cause and the damage of certain weapons, getting into duels isn't a bad idea at all. Slaanesh can just throw 6 mortal wounds on an enemy if they roll under their save stat, no questions asked. And for a bit more of a general look, the Lords of Pain and Hubris can certainly put the hurt on regular units, but those stat lines seem better off being thrown at a hero rather than a swarm of lesser enemies. The army also has a million little tricks you can pull off to debuff the enemy, buff yourself, and overall make playing against you as annoying as possible. Blissbarb Seekers can reduce an enemy unit's save if they wound them, opening them up for the Demonette fun times. Hellstriders with Hell Scourges can keep enemy units with 1 or 2 wounds on their models from contesting objectives, so if you hate the Skaven or Undead beyond all reason, you can make sure anyone playing those armies is miserable. Does your opponent have a wizard on the field? Big mistake on their part. An Infernal and Rapturous can force them to re-roll the spell and put D3 mortal wounds on them depending on their roll, which if I'm remembering my rules correctly, affects every single wizard in the game that isn't techless, because he doesn't roll. Fiends, meanwhile, make them worse at being wizards if they're within 12 inches. And Rapturous is 110 points and Fiends are 180 for 3, which is 290 points to make sure that anyone trying to cast a spell regrets not playing something like the Caradhran Overlords instead. Fiends can also be pretty brutal monster killers given how their damage works, so there's another way to surprise someone. Shout out to the Godseeker spell that lets you reduce every single movement an enemy unit can do to 3 inches. Normal movement, running, charging, 3 inches. I didn't think it was possible for someone to be slower than the Death Guard, but apparently you can force that terrible fate on someone. Across the board of the army, if you look hard enough, you can find a way to make yourself better at something, or the enemy worse at something. Very enjoyable stuff. It's also kinda lore-friendly. Aside from the rules fluffing it as Slaaneshi demons are so magically attractive they screw with the enemy's minds, she's all about pain as well as pleasure. Slaanesh is in excess of everything, pain included, and giving your enemy 100 minor debuffs before forcing them to move at a snail's pace is certainly going to be painful. This army also grows exponentially more powerful as the game goes on. This is because of the Depravity Point system. Depravity Points are your own special pool of resources that can do a variety of things. In terms of outright making the army better, the simplest is the buffs having more of them provide. At 12, 24, and 36 points, enemies subtract 1 from hit rolls, you cause free mortal wounds on a hit roll of 6, and gain a 5-up ward respectively. So before you even start spending them, they're making the army a whole lot better, and if all that wasn't enough, you use them to summon extra units onto the field. The price of course depends on what you're summoning, and you will naturally lose whatever buffs if you go under the threshold, and it does have to be both 9 inches from an enemy as well as within 12 inches of a friendly hero. All that being said, pulling a Keeper of Secrets out of your asshole is a phenomenal way to ruin the enemy's day. That's also lore friendly, because that's probably where one of them would be hiding. Getting the points isn't terribly difficult either. You get 6 die at the start of each battle round to act as temptation dice, and every time an opponent fails a hit, wound, or save roll, you can offer them one to act as an automatic roll of 6. If they say no, they take D3 mortal wounds. If they say yes, you get D6 depravity points. You can't save them between rounds and can only offer it on a unit once per phase, so feel free to offer these dice freely. That alone can potentially rake in the points fast, and throughout the army there's a whole host of units and abilities that can conjure them up as well. Not only is this mechanic just fun, it's also so incredibly lore friendly. It's a literal deal with the devil as far as the game goes, and if nothing else, throwing D3 mortal wounds on someone for free is a small but appreciable thing. And lastly, most of the models in their range have been given the Age of Sigmar glow-up treatment. Myrmidon Painbringers are some of the best models I've ever seen, and they make me think of an excessive vanity above all else. Glutos is horrible to look at but in a fun way, and is a wonderful showcase of gluttony, and I don't think I need to tell you that Sigvald's new model is one of the best GWs ever put out. This is what Slaanesh is all about. The crab claws and half tits are fine, but this is what excess looks like. Even if only to kit bash onto another army, I'd highly recommend snagging some of these kits. If you're an Emperor's Children fan, just paint Sigvald purple and you've got a Fulgrim. Maybe it can tide you over for the next 5 years before GW finally releases them in 40k. For lore downsides, it's going to be more or less exactly what you imagine. If you find the idea of the pursuit of pleasure above all other things reprehensible, get the hell away from these guys. Slaaneshi followers can and will do the most horrendous things for a quick high, so if you'd like any sort of goal beyond being a faction of gooners, you'll be left wanting here. In fact, Slaanesh is probably the evilest of the Chaos gods. Chaos worship tends to be evil all the time, but Slaanesh is the next level. Followers of Nurgle are part of one big disgusting family, so there can be a twisted sort of love there. Not always, but there can be. Khorne likewise can be taken as an honorable warrior god, and if nothing else, his followers go after the big fights against equals first before they start murdering random people in the street. Even Tzeentch can be somewhat altruistic. Plenty of his cults start with good intentions, given his status as the god of hope. Backstabbing is expected, granted, but it's at least backstabbing that'll ideally lead to someone's plans being furthered, some goal being achieved. By contrast, a Slaaneshi will backstab you for no other reason than they wanted to, and they thought it'd be fun. Cities will be ransacked, their people put to the sword and subjected to the worst fates imaginable because someone inside of it called a Slaaneshi warlord a prick. Or in the case of people like Sigvald, because the people inside of it have better hair than he does and that can't stand. For all it can be said that each of the Chaos gods have some positive aspects, it comes into play practically with Slaanesh the least. The worst crimes imaginable will be committed for fun, pleasure, and vanity, so if you want any sort of moral positive in your faction, stay far away. Slaanesh being gone can also be a turnoff. As much as it can and has led to all sorts of interesting narratives for both the Hedonites and other factions, your big boss man is still locked up. Getting closer to breaking out every day, but that hasn't happened yet, and Slaanesh's ultimate role continues to be a source of elf souls for the elven gods. If you don't mind or want to be the underdog, then this is no problem, but if you want something greater than that, at the very least you'll have to wait for her to potentially break free. Also, you might have noticed that a whole lot of the lore I said here was just talking about Slaanesh rather than the Hedonites specifically. This is because, at least from the readings I've done, the Hedonites themselves aren't the most character-driven faction. They're driven by Slaanesh as a whole. This can lead to some positives, like you've got a pretty clean slate to make whatever homebrew you can think of for these guys. But aside from Sigvald and the twins, there isn't a huge bevy of characters to get invested in. Even then, Sigvald isn't the most interesting character in narrative terms. It's fun to watch him do his thing, but on a large-scale level. I don't care about his thoughts, I just want to see him wage war on Nagash because of his bruised ego. Go look at Sigvald's origin in fantasy, and he's beyond horrific, so I don't think I want a book about Sigvald. It'll either water him down and make him not really Sigvald anymore, or it'll be the most horrific book I've ever read, and I won't have fun reading it. On that note, you're also shit out of luck if you want anything resembling a grand cause to fight for. Even the Godseekers really just want to restore Slaanesh to power so they can get back to having the most efficient fun times possible. There's something to be said about going with the flow, but there's also something to be said about having an army that isn't just one big aristocrats joke. For tabletop downsides, the flip side of their speed and potentially high damage is that they're fragile as all hell. I mentioned you can trade rather than snipe with those Seekers earlier with a turn 1 charge because the moment your enemy's turn is up, they're going to be very dead. Beyond that, I think there's 4 things in the entire roster that have a 3-up save. One of them is Sigvald, the other is Gludos, the Myrminesh Painbringers, and Archaon. And I'm not really going to count Archaon because that's Archaon. It feels like cheating including him. That 5-up ward save you get from the depravity points isn't a way to make your army tanky, it's to keep it from falling apart with a mean look. There are ways around this, like the Myrminesh can go up to a 2-up save in enemy territory or if they're contesting an objective. There's a decent amount of models with a ward save or ways to get one too. And taking some Slaves to Darkness models as a coalition can also help. But on the whole, you're very vulnerable to someone coming out the gate swinging. If you don't strike first, there's decent odds some of your units are getting wiped quickly. In fact, play them how you would play a melee-focused Eldar army in 40k. Get in quick, hard, and fast, because otherwise it isn't looking good. Speaking of, as with most cast armies, your ranged game is pretty limited. The Blissbarb Archers aren't horrible by any means, especially for dealing with chaff. Same for the Blissbarb Seekers, with the added bonus of them weakening an enemy's save. But that kind of emphasizes my point, I feel. Your ranged units exist to either soften the enemy up for melee, or clear out weaker units so you can rush into melee with the important things. In this regard, the Eldar comparison kinda falls apart, because dear god, getting caught unaware by a squad of warp spiders or swooping hawks is the stuff of nightmares. As a result of this army is very focused on not only proper positioning, but choosing your target targets wisely. Related to choosing your targets wisely is that ignoring rend isn't the most terribly difficult thing in the game, so be careful not to throw yourself into too dangerous a situation. This is something that can definitely date the video, because every now and then GW will massively change how things like that work, or how many buffs and whatnot can be stacked or applied. So who knows, maybe when 4th drops in yesterday, oops, well maybe that'll have changed. I'm going to bank entirely on these videos holding up as generalities rather than too much specific analysis to save me, because there's a very high chance this entire video is going to age like milk the moment I put it out. Their magic is also pretty mediocre, which is only worsened by the fact each of the 3 sub-factions of Invaders, Pretenders, and Godseekers can only take their spell lore. I always feel a bit iffy on giving it a definitive yay or nay when it comes to magic, because there's almost certainly someone out there who can do good stuff with any army's magic, but in my personal opinion, it's mediocre. The Invaders is probably the biggest problem because one of the spells uses the enemy's bravery characteristic, and 4th edition is just removing that, so who knows what'll take its place. One of the other spells can pretty substantially reduce a unit's move characteristic permanently, which can be huge, but probably not too helpful after the first turn or 2 of the game. The other one does the same for a unit's attack characteristic, which can be good against some units but pretty worthless against others. Reducing Gordrak's attacks by 1 is still going to get you blended, and you physically can't reduce something like Clannarets to 0 attacks, so in that case it doesn't matter either. Godseeker Wizards are all about movement shenanigans, which is nice, but the army is so naturally fast it'll be more of a cherry on top than a vital part of your game plan. And the Pretender spell lore is easily my favorite, because one of them gets you more depravity points, and that's always good. So overall, kinda eh. The random spells are pretty good though, being a fairly cheap source of mortal wounds as well as potentially depravity points depending on which one you pick. On that topic though, depravity points. Because this is the core army mechanic of the faction, it means that many games are going to be based around how many you have. And in some cases, gaining any of them can be heavily hindered if your opponent just tells you to fuck off. Like I said before, unbelievably lore-friendly stuff, and there are plenty of ways for you to get them with your own efforts. But if your battle plan revolves around the temptation dice and your opponent is Sigmar's most celibate paladin, you're in trouble. Plus, depending on the army, eating D3 mortal wounds every now and again to deny you a core resource isn't the end of the world, especially if they have methods of healing. The average ogre glutton has 4 wounds a pop. Maxing out the temptation dice refusal at 3 damage won't even kill one of them. This relates back to getting wiped early as well, because if you lose or can't summon methods of getting depravity points, you're going to find your army falls apart in short order. You're playing with an early game handicap, so if nothing else, at least have a vague idea of what to do, either for the first few turns before the depravity kicks in, or in case your opponent refuses to take your deals. The system also encourages you to spread your attention across the board to get multiple depravity points quickly, so that can cause issues as well. Euphoric Killers guarantees a pretty steady stream of them as long as you're hurting things, but the flip side is that you can't focus all your attention on one unit. It's based around causing wounds, not strictly speaking killing, so when you kill more of a unit, it has less wounds to give you depravity points with. That means that for gaining the most points, you gotta pick different units. Which is fun if you're a bit too into BDSM, but it also to some extent punishes you for focusing on one single unit and striking a decisive blow. Temptation dice can also very easily backfire if you misread the situation. Gaining D6 depravity points in exchange for your opponent getting a guaranteed kill shot on a Keeper of Secrets is not an even trade, so careful not to play yourself like that. And while I am sneaking in a positive here, it's because it leads to the funniest downside I've ever seen on the planet, and I want that to be a 1-2 punch. This is perhaps the best army to play if you yourself are a persuasive and charismatic person. No one said you can't try and butter them up to take your offer after all. It's entirely up to you to convince them to take the temptation dice. What you're giving them is in the name. Pick an opponent that's weak-willed and smooth-talk them into getting themselves killed. I mean, come on now, that natural 6 I'm offering would wipe out the last of those Mirmadesh. Won't you just take me up on my offer just this once? Won't you shake a poor sinner's hand? Or just bribe them with real-life money. Give them $20 so you get your D6 points. Of course, this also means this army is actively preventing you from gaining your core resource if you don't know how to talk to people. No one will take your temptation dice if you can't look them in the eyes when you speak and can't carry a conversation to save your life. This is the funniest mechanic I've ever seen. Play this army if you need practice with talking to people. This is the best fucking positive I've ever seen in my life. Holy shit, James Workshop, that is funny. And lastly, their pricing. It's a lovely mix of fairly cheap and very expensive. The relatively older models are fairly cheap. The Demonettes on Seekers, the regular ones, and some characters like the Mask aren't too bad. All under $42, which by GW standards ain't awful. Then we get to the new stuff, and GW pricing rears its ugly head. $62.50 for the Mirmadesh and Simbaresh boxes of 5 each. Blissbarb archers are $60, $168 for a Keeper of Secrets, $62.50 for Sigvald. The only positive thing I feel I can say for that is, hey, you're not paying for Mortarion. This is the flip side of getting the Age of Sigmar model treatment. You get Age of Sigmar model prices. And that was the Hedonites of Slaanesh Do or Don't, also known as immediately dating a video because I forgot 4th edition was coming out the day before. If nothing else, let this stand as a monument to my hubris and poor planning skills, and you can make fun of me for it. Thank you as always to my channel members. You are the excess to my Slaanesh, keeping me going in ways I cannot describe in a public forum. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Something something horny, something something Fudunari, something something about arguing over whether or not Slaanesh even cares about sex. There, I've taken care of 50% of the comments anyone's gonna leave me. Go figure out something different to say below, you uncreative cockroaches.